hello everyone. I'm Mara Loveman. I'm professor and chair of the sociology department here at Berkeley. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Laura Nader. Professor Nader has been a professor of anthropology here at Berkeley for several decades. Her pioneering scholarship has shaped the discipline of anthropology, and her pioneering example and ways of teaching have shaped Berkeley as a community of research and learning in profound ways across these years. Professor Nader is the author or co-author of several books and over 280 articles and book chapters. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her work has contributed to the development of the comparative ethnography of law and dispute resolution, comparative family organization, the anthropology of the powerful, and comparative research on the domain of phenomena that she calls controlling processes. Among Professor Nader's many important contributions was her very early call in the late 1960s for anthropologists and social scientists more broadly to focus our research on, quote, the study of the colonizers rather than the colonized, the culture of power rather than the culture of the powerless, and the culture of affluence rather than the culture of poverty. This call remains resonant to this day. Finally, I just want to note that according to Professor Nader's fascinating Wikipedia page, the field of anthropology, her contributions to the field of anthropology have led her to be described as, quote, the embodied moral conscience of post-Boasian American anthropology. No minor compliment. Today, Professor Nader will talk to us about area studies, the pluses and minuses, drawing from her recent book, What the Rest Think of the West. So please join me in welcoming Professor Laura Nader.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I, just as an opening to encourage the young, I think that my paper, Up the Anthropologist, studying up, down, and sideways, which would include the colonized and the colonizers, I was shunned at that meeting when I delivered that. And Irving Goffman, the sociologist, came up to me and said, no, we don't know how to do that sort of work. And I said, you mean we know how to go to New Guinea, avoid being eaten by the cannibals, learn their language, and we don't know how to study up, down, and sideways? And then nobody else at that meeting would talk to me. So my mother was taking care of my baby upstairs, and I told her nobody would talk to me. I was shunned. And she said, no matter how hard you try, you can never please all the people. So please yourself. So I do. Now, and it's been really exciting to do that. I want to start with the pluses of area studies, because there are pluses. And some of them are obvious. If you study an area, you learn a language. You learn something about the geography, hopefully. You learn something about the history, and you get a general understanding of the field. So when I was an undergraduate, I studied Latin American literature, which gave me a big picture about Latin America and so forth. Now, there are other reasons why there are pluses. It's easier to get funding, because people fund area studies. It's easier to get published, because there are journals that focus on those areas. Then you get invited to international meetings. And it's not a bad thing, seemingly, right? But as I'm going to tell you, there are some minuses. Now, when I was at Harvard doing my graduate work, we had to pick 4 areas. Imagine 4. And we had to know about the archaeology, the language, all the way up to the present. So my areas were South America, North America, Europe, and the Middle East. That's a huge area to cover, right? But we were expected to know. I mean, one of the questions on my exam was what was in the Mayan level 5, what was there in the archaeology. And you had to know those things. So you really got a bottom-up picture. When I was hired at Berkeley, I was hired to teach 2 area courses. They were thought to be area courses. One was Middle East, and the other was South American Indians, which I'll get back to in a minute, because South American Indians is not a course that's presently taught. You'll see. So the origins of these area courses, as we know them today, of course there was a lot of different reasons, but certainly in the Middle East, there were military orients. Military. So in the Middle East, Alfred Thayer Mayer, in the 19th century, invented the Middle East. It was the area between India and Europe. That covers a big area. Lots of different languages, right? And the joke among Middle Easterners is middle of what and east of what? And of course that's an open question still today. So these national security issues were very important then for the Middle East and obviously today. And it's obvious that some of the resources in the area are one of the reasons for it. All kinds of resources, not just oil. Now, Latin American studies, I don't know a lot about the origin of Latin American studies, but I can ask the question, what's Latin about the Zapotec Indians that I studied? They're not Latin. They're indigenous people. So does Latin American studies cover indigenous people? And is that an insulting category to them? They're not Latin. They're Zapotec, they're Mayan, they're Incan, whatever. But they've been subsumed into Latin American studies. Now among the Zapotec, where I was for many years, I thought what was interesting is that they had a concept called relaciones exteriores, external relations. Who were they having external relations with? The state. So they perceived themselves as outside the state. But we, who study Latin American studies, perceive themselves as inside the Latin background. Now, one of the big minuses, I'm going to tell you a bunch of minuses, since they're not often talked about, and they're as true for Latin American studies as any as in the Middle East. You can't compare out of region. You can compare northern Mexico from southern Mexico, but you can't compare Mexico with the United States, or they don't. So let me give some examples from the Middle East. I wrote a paper once called Orientalism, Occidentalism, and the Control of Women. And it was a story about two patriarchies, one in the East and one in the West. And I showed how, in order to control women in both societies, they point the finger. You've always all heard the finger. Muslim women don't have any rights. They say the same thing. Western women don't have any rights. They don't have equal pay. They take our literature, the feminist literature, and they just feed it back over the radio and TV in places like Cairo. And I happened to go to the Michael Moore film. How many of you have seen it? What Country Shall We Invade Next? It's an amazing film with a bad title that I think gave it because people thought, well, it means another Muslim country we're going to invade. But they invade Europe. He invades Europe. And he goes around and then all the things he learns from Europe, much of which started here, but they're using there. So it's a great film and you really ought to take a look at it. But too patriarchal, anyway, one of the things in that film was the story of Tunisia, the Arab Spring. And I remember when my mother was 96 years old, sitting in a chair, and she was watching television and they were debating abortion in this country. The anti-abortionists, she said, what is that about? And I told her, and she sat up in her chair and she said, not their business. Really? Not their business? Well, in Tunisia, in this film, those of you who saw it, they interviewed one of the leaders in Tunisia, a male Muslim, and he said, it's not the business of the state to regulate a woman's body. That's a patriarchal society. We're a patriarchal society. Look what's happening on the question of abortion in this country. So the Orientalism, Occidentalism, and the control of women, I sent it to 2 journals. First one turned it down, second one turned it down, both American journals. They didn't have good reasons to turn it down, and besides, I knew there was something there because the reviews are so vicious. They said things like, either talk about Muslim women or talk about Western women, but don't talk about 2 of them in the same. Well, so I sent it to Belgium, a journal called Cultural Dynamics. They took it instantly. As soon as it was published, then it spread all over the place, got translated by the French and French feminists and so on, all over French Canada and so on, where these issues were very alive and happening. So the first minus is you have to discuss patriarchal systems one at a time. And of course then you don't understand what's really going on. Now, there's a very interesting piece that was written by a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and it was called Honor Killings in the West. Your article says, she's writing about an article on family stones woman to death in the Islamic world. Your article says that since 2013, 869 women suffered honor killings in Pakistan. Compare this to the United States, where 3 women a day are killed by their male partners. Today, in our country. By my count, she says, since 2013, that's about 1,095 women killed. So we are then under some illusion, if we don't do comparison, because we're in the area, that somehow we don't challenge the assumptions or the truths that are accepted, which is extremely dangerous for our country. Because then we can't think rationally when we do things like invade Iraq without thinking about consequences. They're going to love us. They're going to welcome us. We're out of touch with some kind of reality. Now, why are we out of touch with reality about Islamic world and all the wars that we're fighting? Every country we've invaded has been Muslim in the last X number of years, since 9/11 certainly. Well, what about Israel? Is Israel Middle Eastern? Well, it's in the Middle East. Should it be taught in a course on the Middle East? Well, some people say yes. Some people say, but it isn't Middle Eastern culture. Yes, they do speak Hebrew now, but the culture is European. And besides, it's a Western beachhead in the Middle East. So if you don't understand that, I'm not saying right or wrong at this point, or could, but if you don't understand that, you don't know what you're doing, and you don't know why they're so angry at us. You can't understand 9/11, a horrendous happening, but you have to understand it in terms of them and us and how the them and us are working. So, area courses are artificial, but they're treated as if they are natural. In Spain, is Spain in North Africa? My mother asked a Spanish woman once in the presence of my daughter, who was mortified that my mother would ask such an ignorant question. But the Spanish woman said, that's what we're trying to figure out. I asked a woman on her PhD orals who specialized in Russia, is Russia in Europe or is it in Asia? She said it's in Asia. I said, are you sure? It's not European? Depends on who you ask. You ask someone in the Middle East, is Russia in Europe or is it in Asia? Of course it's European. Just look at the history. They're not Asian. So these things, to be clarified, you have to cross boundaries. You have to understand who's talking, where it's coming from, and so on. Now, when Bush was in when Iraq, they were talking about invading Syria at that time. And Amnesty International should be ashamed of itself because it went to Syria, interviewed women and men, interviewed women, married couples, and said that something like 26% of Syrian men beat their wives. So I've asked audiences, if you found that out, what would you do? And they often say, I'd do something about those Syrian women. I said, I didn't do that. I went to the library, and I said to our librarian, Suzanne Calpestri, look up the figures on the United States. Same numbers. Surprise, surprise. Why didn't Amnesty International publish both numbers? That's a danger of focusing on an area. Now, one of my really brilliant students, Ellen Hertz, did her thesis on the Shanghai stock market. And I suggested she compare it to the New York stock market, which she did. Then her book came out. The comparison was taken out. That's why it was interesting. Why was the comparison taken out? The publisher said, it has to fit an area course curriculum. So the comparison was gone. The book, as a result, is nowhere near as good as the thesis. Another student of mine, Erin Moore, was studying women in India. And she did the same thing. I insist on comparison, even though it gives you insight, makes you think, is it really, makes you think critically. And so she did a comparison, Indian women, American women, different classes and so on. They made her take it out because it had to fit Southeast Asian area courses. So what are we getting as a result of area courses here? Now, one of my Syrian students, actually Lebanese student, Maysoon Sukaria, wrote her thesis in the School of Education here on studying the hearts and minds of Muslims. Remember, that was George W.'s, who's going to study the hearts and minds of Muslims. And she's interested in educating the young. So she worked on interviewing people in Washington, D.C., interviewing people in the Gulf, interviewing people in Jordan to see what that meant on the ground in all these places. She crossed the boundaries, the area boundaries. Can't get it published. Crossed the area boundaries. So we're censoring here. And I think that that's a very serious issue in terms of building knowledge. Now, I wrote a book recently, 2013, I think. It was called Culture and Dignity, Dialogues Between the Middle East and the West. Now think about the subtitle. And if you were going to do a cover for that book, what would you do? Culture and Dignity, Dialogues Between the Middle East and the West. Where's that going to fit? You have to make it fit an area course. Well, what do they need the dialogues for in an area course? And of course, they've been dialoguing for a long time. So they were going to do the cover. Actually, you have to laugh. It's funny, but it isn't funny, And camels and marketplaces. So they kept sending me these covers with camels and marketplaces. So I said, I like camels, and I love marketplaces, but that's not what the book is about. The book is about two civilizations interacting. Civilization? The Middle East, a civilization? Yes. Middle East is a civilization. The Middle East gave the world three major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Europe never did that. They borrowed religion from the Middle East. Yes, it's a civilization. So we finally got a really beautiful cover. But it took educating the marketing people. So it's not just the publishers, the marketing people, the artwork. Some years ago, when Clinton became president, first thing he did was bomb Iraq. And it's always unfortunate when you bomb, because usually people die. But in this case, the place hit a major Iraqi artist and her husband. They were asleep in bed. That was Clinton's first, I'm going to do good. And I thought to myself, along with a couple of other colleagues, they would only do that if they thought that the Iraqis and the Arabs were barbarians. They don't know anything about this part of the world. So we started an organization, Arab Women Artists. Arab women artists? Arab artists? It was a no-brainer for people. What do you mean Arab art? Well, just take a look at Arab art. It's been there for a long time. Before the caves. And we started this, and we got we went to Washington, D.C. to the the Women's Art Museum, and we proposed this show of Arab women artists, contemporary, right? From Morocco to Iraq, and they never thought we could raise the funds, so they agreed, and we needed $500,000 or whatever to get it, and we did raise the funds. And it was the best attended show they'd ever had because nobody could believe that there was Arab art or Arab women artists. But Arab women always have their covered faces and they have no rights, they're patriarchal over there. And these misinformations get passed in universities, not just among the hoi polloi. That's what's so dangerous. They lead us to war. They lead us to be ignorant. That's not what we're about in the universities. So, I want to tell you one more thing that happens, which is intimidation. You go to do field work in the Middle East, and people start monitoring what you do. Maybe you're ISIS in cover, undercover. Maybe you're really a Muslim and you're saying you're a Christian or whatever. The only reason I can say the things I can say is I was baptized Christian, and my uncle was an archbishop. But I should be able to say that anyways, if it was based on knowledge. And recently, Stanford University, got to salute Stanford University. They published a book about what happens to scholars working in the Middle East and intimidation. What happened to Dirks when he was hired here? Any of you remember what happened in the interview with Dirks? Dirks is an India specialist. He was a friend of Edward Said's. His problem was he wanted the job too much. They interviewed him, the PR guy at Berkeley, and they said, "Is it true that you signed the divestment, blah, blah, whatever?" And he said no when he had, or his wife had, and embarrassed his wife, embarrassed his people, and so on. And I said to the chancellor, then Chancellor Birgeneau, "You mean to tell me if you're going to be chancellor at the University of California, you have to answer questions like that?" And sitting next to him was a law professor from Berkeley. And he said, "That's right." I said, "But this isn't Israel, this is the United States." So the intimidation, it's in that book. The intimidation of our chancellor is in that book, as well as the intimidation of other people. What's interesting is, at the American Anthropology meetings, we had this whole discussion about Israeli universities, and there was a vote, and it's something like 1,100 to 150. And the interesting thing is it broke by age, not by ethnicity, not by religion. There are people in all fields and all across the board who do not want more war, unnecessary war, and they voted. And then people were upset. They thought it was anti-Semitic, but all of the young Jews for Peace were there. There were Israelis there who were voting with Jews for Peace. So we have to sort of separate out all of this other stuff. Now let me get to Latin America, about which you all know much more. And that has to do with Oscar Lewis's book, to begin with. Oscar Lewis wrote a book that discussed about Mexico, that discussed a lot of Mexicans. And so there was one Mexican economist who wrote an answer. How many of you have heard of Los Hijos de Jones? No. Latin Americans, how many of you are in Latin American studies? Only one? Really? That's interesting. Los Hijos de Jóvenes is about a Park Avenue family. And he sort of does it in reverse. He does the subordination in reverse job, right? There aren't many books like that, or many articles or anything like that about Latin America speaking back. I mean, there's Eduardo Galeano, The Open Veins of Latin America, but he calls it the open veins of Latin America, and the veins that are mostly open are indigenous people in Latin America. So there again, even Eduardo Galeano, who wrote a fabulous book. So now let's move into what motivated me to do this book, What the Rest Think of the West. What the Rest Think of the West, it says at the bottom, since 600 AD. Was there a West in 600 AD? Well, it was before Kipling, when he said the West is West and the East is East, and never the two twain shall meet. But yes, because everybody knew where the sun set, and people were traveling. And the first guy to go west went west from China to India. That was west. Right? And then we have Ibn Fadlan, who goes west by going north, and Ibn Fadlan goes up the Volga River, and he encounters the Vikings. And then there are the Chinese later on who go west, in fact go east to the United States. So what is west? That's part of the whole question here. But the main motivation is, really, when I was a graduate student, I read a book, a collection by Carlton Kuhn, who's often described as a racist, but he did a great, not everybody's black and white. And Kuhn had published some of the, what's his name? Some of the early padres who were in Mexico and how they were writing about so forth, Castillo. Yes, right. And he also published Ibn Fadlan going up the Volga and meeting these really weird people, the Vikings. And he commented on their clothes. The women wear clothes so short you can see their underwear. You can see that they don't have any underwear, he said. And he arrived just when a big chief had died. The custom was to burn a woman virgin along with the chief in the boat. So he basically sacrificed the women. Well, from a Damascus point of view, this was barbaric, right? From anybody's point of view, it's barbaric. Today, maybe. But God knows we're all barbarians. But so he goes up the Volga and he sees this, and he's a missionary. He was trying to change the religion of these really people who didn't have any religion, so on. And he writes in his book what the other guy says about him. You Muslims, you're a bunch of idiots. You just bury your people right away and let the bugs eat them. Ours go to paradise right away because we burn the boat and they're in paradise. So you get this sense of, which you don't often get today, they not only tell you about them, in the same voice they tell you about what them thinks of them. So this is so interesting that objectivity had not yet been invented. The whole notion of objectivity hadn't been invented. So when Al-Tahtawi in 1826, after Napoleon invaded, for what reason, Egypt, and slaughtered all the people, beheaded them, by the way, and so on, Muhammad Ali wanted to know who these French were anyway. They didn't even know who they were. And they had all this equipment that they could kill people so easily. So he sent a whole group of students to Paris to study the French and come back and talk about these people. Again, whenever he noticed something about the French, he would talk about himself. So he'd say, these people don't have whatever they have or don't have. They don't have any. The Basques is a very good example. these people have very clean baths in France. And he said, they're cleaner than ours, but I think ours are better because ours are steam baths, and I think steam baths are better than regular baths. So in the process, you get this picture of the eye that sees. And no matter how objective we may try to be, as Cardozo once said, you can never forget the fact that you see with your own eyes. So you have to correct for it all the time by looking at he who's looking at you. That's very, very important. One of my favorite people in this book is a brilliant Chinese scholar named Liang Jiao, turn of the century. He wanted to bring democracy to China. So there was a coup and they kicked him out. He went to Japan. He read de Tocqueville. You know what de Tocqueville was, the French talking about the other was us. And he said, I would like to go visit this country, this democracy. So he came to the United States, about 28 years old. I mean, imagine that happening today. Comes to this country and he says, I want to meet two people. I want to meet J.P. Morgan, and I want to meet President Roosevelt. He gets a 5-minute interview with J.P. Morgan, because J.P. Morgan doesn't give more than 5-minute interviews. And he comes away and he says, American capitalism will destroy American democracy, which is exactly what's happened with corporate capitalism. That's what he meant by American capitalism, because there are many different kinds of capitalism. But American capitalism, corporate capitalism, will destroy America. So then he goes to visit Teddy Roosevelt, who was a very jovial sort, and he gave him a lot of time, I guess. He came away from that and he said, American empire will destroy China. And he went back to China and he said, we don't need democracy. We need a strong central government. That was 1901. We don't listen. The other is mute. The other has no voice. Look what happened when Edward Said began to write his works on Orientalism. The other is mute. If they speak, we should shut them up. We should listen. So this is a book about the rest. Even anthropologists were saying in the 1970s and 80s, we have to speak for the natives. The natives are speaking, we're not listening. Remember Vine Delorio, his book, We Talk, You Listen, American Indians? We talk, you listen. So I think there's some wisdom to learn from these things that we're experiencing. And I want to say one more thing. What's going to happen to area studies? Is it going to stay? Is it going to go away? Well, one of the things that threatens area studies, of course, is globalization. What's an area? Well, people are crossing borders from El Salvador to the United States, from Mexico, back and forth. From now, look at what's happening in Europe with all these invasions, unquote, from refugees coming to Europe. So is it going to be the end of area studies? I don't think so. Is it going to be affected by this? Maybe. So if you have any solutions, what would they be? And mine is very simple. You have to recognize the plus and minus of area studies in order to make comparison possible. Because area studies without comparison leads to the kind of problems I've been talking about. You can't understand Mexico without understanding the United States. You can't understand the veins of Latin America without understanding corporate power. You can't understand yourself without looking in the mirror. And I think without comparison, then we're in an illusion of knowledge and it's not knowledge. So that's basically my solution. Keep them both. Keep the area studies, make sure the comparison is possible. When students come here from South America or Middle Mexico, make sure comparison is possible. Don't just send them back there to do work that we can use in our national security state or whatever. Make sure that they can say what they want to say. Now recently, I began to notice, as I work more and more with undergraduates, because graduate students are too careerist in my mind today, I said to myself, they're scared. So I thought, I'm going to put together a bunch of my essays, starting with Up the Anthropologist and ending with Controlling Processes. All of these being essays where I've been screamed at in public and told I was wrong and so on and so forth by physicists who are being videotaped across all the national labs, jumping up and down saying, "You're terrible, you're awful. You talk to us as if we were like anybody else." And I said, you are. The one thing social scientists know is that humans make mistakes. What you're going to do, plug that into your technology. The first 2 nuclear accidents in the United States were caused by human error or human weakness. One was Idaho, where a guy was sleeping with another guy's wife, and he said, "I'm going to blow the whole state of Idaho up." He almost did. The other one was in Alabama, where a guy lit a candle because the lights had gone off, and he almost blew up Alabama. So you have to understand the human component here. But the book of essays that I'm thinking of writing, I thought, you know what, I'm going to call it Contrarian Anthropology, to encourage the young to be contrarian. It's the opposite of harmony ideology. Contrarian. If you need to be loved, I tell my students, you will never do what you need to do. You can't need to be loved. You have to love something called truth and beauty, which is presumably what we're about in the universities. So recognize the pluses and the minuses and make comparison important, and we can go on from there. Questions? Anybody? Yes.
During the sixth, the Kennedy administration had a program, Alliance for Progress in Latin America, and they sent tons of powdered milk to the poor people of Brazil. And the people said, well, we have a fresh milk, we don't like that. And all these bags, 60 kilos of powdered milk, were sitting there doing nothing. A lot of money spent because they didn't bother to go there and say, what do you need? The beans, rice, sugar. They just sent powdered milk, and it was lost.
Well, this is a problem with aid in general. There's a person that's put together a book called The Politics of Aid, basically. And you never ask them because you know best. It's arrogance, like Fulbright said. Arrogance, power. Any questions? Comments? Yes?
I go to lectures in critical theory, and it's a lot like what you're talking about. And I have several questions actually. The ideas of Isaiah Berlin contrasted with those of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and topic comparisons. I mean, there's a lot of comparative studies in politics and sociology. You know, I think that's what you're talking about is comparative studies by topics. You know, the treatment of women and comparing. I think that's done a lot in academia, comparative studies. So would that take care of this problem you have about?
Well, I'm not so impressed with what they do in comparative studies, and
I mean, as an idea.
As an idea, it's a wonderful idea. And I mean, we're talking about general education in this country, more general education. Well, that's part of what we should be doing. On the other hand, sometimes you have to start somewhere else. So I teach a course on energy, and I'm talking about energy in a democratic society. And I can bring in what they're doing in Denmark and Germany and other places. It's not exactly comparative society. There should be that, but I have to give them the contrast on the spot. And especially in solar, I mean, we're so far behind in so many of the energy issues compared to Europe. Never mind comparing us to the booga booga, but compared to Europe. But then there's the arrogance, you know, of compare. We talk about Anthropocene. Who's we? Anthropocene? The Zapotec didn't get us into this mess. Exxon got us into this mess, and the oil companies, the climate change mess. So where does journalism start and the comparison that's rigorous and so on end? You have to really, I mean, it's very careful. People have to be very careful. Sometimes they're so careful, they want to do controlled comparison, and you miss the point. Because you need, I've written a paper about different kinds of comparisons. And controlled comparison is not what I'm talking about. I can compare, and did, two Zapotec villages. But I can't compare a Zapotec village in a controlled manner to the United States of America. So it depends on how you use the units. Thanks for the question. Good.
Thank you.
What else?
I have a little tiny question. Is Zapotec a Aztecan language?
Is it the second language?
No, is Zapotec and Aztecan language? Is it in that language family?
No, it's not. It's, boy, you caught me now because I haven't thought about that for such a long time. What? What? No, it's Zapotec is Otomanguean language family. We've got the languages all sorted out very well, and it's not Uto-Aztecan.
I had one question.
Yeah.
I have one problem. My question is this: you are encouraging through this book and with your job, with your professional work, to dialogue, between equals. You think that once we get that level, what's next? What is next?
What's
when we as civilization, we can talk and recognize each other as, do comparisons and learn from each other. Once we can get that, what is next?
What is next?
And then your vision.
Thank you. What is next after we dialogue, or if we do dialogue? One of the things that's next is you can understand the question, why do they hate us, better. So if you care about solutions, that's a big problem in this country. We got more, who was it that said we got more problems than we deserve and more solutions than we use? If you care about solutions, that's where, then you get people thinking about solutions. Maybe you get some bottom-up change happening in either country. Many of the thing to understand is that it is not simple, because many Latin American democracies today were inspired by American democracy. So, but what's happening to our democracy? They're building democracy, and we're in decline. Just look at the elections. What a mess. That's not just the Republicans either, I'll say. It's a mess. It's not one person, one vote, all of a sudden we're in decline. But anyway, we've inspired people. That's the main thing that American society has done. When I get depressed, I read the Jefferson letters. If anybody wants to feel good, just buy a copy of the Jefferson letters. I remember one day I was feeling down, and I flipped through the letters, and here he was writing a letter to James Madison, and he said, "Have you ever seen the world in a more awful shape?" This is Jefferson, 1789 or something like that. Well, the world isn't in awful shape today. The difference between his time and our time is technology. And that gets into the whole business of technology. Now, sometimes you can learn if you're ready. Sometimes you're not. But I remember having an argument with the Moroccan governors who came to Berkeley about 15, 20 years ago. And I went from one to the other looking for someone who spoke English and Arabic. They're all speaking French, right? And so I found this guy, and I started to argue with him about nuclear reactors. Up and down the coast of Morocco, they have these nuclear water reactors. They don't work. That's why the French sold it to them. I said, you don't have the infrastructure, back and forth. He got so irritated with me, he said the following. Look, the French, they have no culture, they have no civilization, but they do know technology. Now that is said by the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Middle Easterners about the West. And if you don't believe it, go to Silicon Valley. They have no culture, they have no civilization, they just know technology. What is Silicon Valley doing for the problems of the world? So you get this critical thinking coming out of this. You know, you don't get necessary immediate solutions. You get critical thinking. Wow, really? I mean, the person I took with me to hear the Michael Moore, to see the Michael Moore film, is a political cross, as I said, between Trump and Bernie Sanders. Really? Very interesting. She thought the film was great. So, why is interesting? I have my own answer to that. But you get people to start thinking. And she's a professor. Not in our department, but she's a professor. Yeah.
You know, sometimes I struggle with people in talking with them about how, well, for example, when you talk to many people in the United States and you suggest that anything less than democracy for another country, that's like blasphemous to suggest. And you've mentioned how in some ways China may have benefited from not being democratic. And I don't know how to help people think about ways that, suggesting, for example, that Libya is going to suddenly be ready for the kind of democracy we have is helpful. And that, you know, the explanation that often gets thrown around is, well, these Middle Easterners are still too tribal. They have a tribal ideology, but tribes are sometimes extremely more egalitarian than democracy.
Is there anything worse than a Republican and Democratic tribes?
Yeah. And these, you know, we have tribal rivalries here that are uglier than they can imagine. I mean, how can we change the thinking of you?
We need a little humility. And sometimes knowledge allows you some humility. But you need knowledge to get to humility, usually. I mean, these are, you know, when you say things like, the Europeans borrowed religion from the Middle East, they never invented a religion, a great religion themselves. They look at you, really? Tell that to the Crusades. You know, the Crusaders went to save Christianity. And they were, what, X generation only of Christianity, didn't even get to Europe till about 350, 400, something like that. So we know better is the aid thing, which is why I wrote one of these essays about the presumption of knowing the answer. For example, in the famines in Africa, the locals really knew how to deal with famines. If we want to do anything on the Middle East, we should look at water and drought, because they still know better than we do. During the whole mess in Syria, a dictator, I don't disagree, and so on. However, Damascus took 1 million Iraqi refugees that were only refugees because we went into war. And on top of that, they had 1 million displaced Syrians because of the drought. Who talked about the drought in Syria? I tried to talk to, you can't always succeed. I took somebody in energy and resources who specializes in water issues and climate change, and I said, why aren't you guys talking about drought in Syria? Well, she said, we're mainly interested in climate change. I said, what do you think that is? It's a continental, I mean, climate change has been going on in the Middle East for a long time. And drought is something they had to learn to deal with, and they figured out different ways of dealing with it. Even in Bolivia, for God's sake, they dealt with water. The archaeologists dig up the Bolivian water, and now they can tell us, the native peoples were right about how to deal with water in Bolivia. Let's bring it back. So the reason we did the film Losing Knowledge is we don't have a sense of losing knowledge. We only have a sense of gaining knowledge. And sometimes the knowledge we're losing is better than the knowledge we're gaining. So, partial answer.
I think, well, after you're saying this, I'm thinking that anthropology, 1 year of it should be required in high schools. It
Oh,
should be
yeah.
Not just the 1 semester of sociology, because the anthropology is really missing, and that's what takes you out of an American
Yeah, that's right.
mentality.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, we tried to get it into Berkeley High,
Really?
and they have so many required courses. They could only fit it during lunch break, and you really can't do that.
Well, these kind of dialogues happen between different cultures where one, I guess, has more money than the other. I mean, for instance, a graduate student going to study indigenous culture in undergrad, part of the exchange program, went and studied a solar program going on in Iraq. But sort of inherently, it's the student or the researcher who has money or a traveler to do this coming to learn about, and no matter how humble you are, it's not the same. The person there is not coming here to pick apart what's going on there. Is there a way to get beyond that, or do you think that's a fundamental
We desperately
problem?
need people from other countries to study us. Desperately need that. But who's doing that? We're sending them all back to study their own people. And more people are going back to study their own people. But we really, if you think you're perfect and exceptional, you know, that's what we have to, that's a real disease. I mean, you think Hillary Clinton, she's going to, 8 years of war we got with Hillary. And why? Because she thinks we're better. Let me give you an example. You remember, those of you who've been here for a while, the Townsend Center woman who was grabbed by the hair by the police when she was trying to calm things down. The students it was about tuition, and she was trying to calm things down, so she said to the police, "Why don't you just arrest me?" It was nonviolent. The police took her by the hair and threw her to another policeman. She ended up in jail. Her husband's a poet laureate here at Berkeley. 2 weeks later, this happened in Egypt. They grabbed a woman during the Arab Spring. They pulled her into the street, etc. And Hillary was there saying, "You should treat your women better." She didn't know what happened here. You don't look in the mirror, that's what you get. Myopia. So it's really very deep. I don't know how you deal with I mean, a couple more examples. Roberto Gonzalez was an applicant to Berkeley. He's a Latino from the border, Mexico and the United States, right? And we have a diversity. And so we're trying to decide who to bring in to graduate school, Berkeley. And someone said, "Oh, he should be on the diversity list." I said, "No, he shouldn't be on the diversity list. He's an engineer, first in his class at University of Texas." And then one of the faculty said, "Give Gonzalez to Nader." So I get Gonzalez, one of my best graduate students, right? Comes into my office, and I said, "Where do you want to do field work?" And he says, "Well, I come from a border town, so I think I'll come." I said, "How about Tibet?" "Tibet?" he said. I said, "Why not?" And then I said, "You're going to watch how you're going to get tracked. You're going to get tracked by the Latin American students here." 2 weeks later, he comes in and says, "I know what you're talking about." And he did a wonderful piece of work with the Zapotec. He's the one who went with me to do Losing Knowledge, and he's chair at San Jose State now and so on. But that's the whole concept. We mean well, we always mean well by doing the diversity, but it's really looking down on him. Put him in diversity. He doesn't need to be in diversity, right? Yeah, anybody else? Yes.
Just want to add nothing. I'm not a student, I'm just a regular person helping to presentation. I'm from Oaxaca State. We have a group on the Mixtec. And all I want to say is that the groups of the natives, people my age and older, they are the ones who are still trying to preserve the custom of the beliefs, which is with nature. which is the sky, the sun, the earth. But the new generations, it's a losing progress again. To start with, if you talk about nature, if you talk about even the water that is sacred, supposedly the new, the modern style, it doesn't go along with. So when you come to school, all those beliefs doesn't count. It just counts supporting what is the modern style. And so that's why. And now, TV, internet, supposedly it's to help us. It's to help us to a degree, but that's if you have a clear mind. When you don't have a clear understanding, basically it just makes a big gathering. And so it doesn't, in the long run, it helps to make your beliefs clear. That's one.
Well, you know, we start the Losing Knowledge film with a little 3.5-year-old who identifies all the plants around him. And we say, we suffer from nature deficiency in this country. Even when I was growing up, we knew all the birds, the flowers in the area, we had to identify the stars and so on. But today, it's all about the machine. And I have in one of my classes a Zapotec, who speaks Zapotec still, although he was born in this country. And he was saying much of what you're saying, but he's still in the mode of thinking about nature, which is why he took my class on energy. So it's not totally hopeless, but it's almost hopeless for our kids more than the migrant kids, because at least the migrant kids have a little bit of connection still to nature. I mean, even the farm kids in our country have a little bit of connection still to nature. They do papers for me, you know, white farmers people, but this is a big problem for everybody. And one of the things I think the Chinese did during the revolution was to send all the urban people back to farm, to get them down to whatever. But look what's happening to China today. So the machine is a very powerful opponent for the reasons that the Moroccan governor stated.
How do we think about this losing knowledge idea when there's the opposite idea of like getting knowledge of everything that's going on in the world with the internet? Like, it's amazing that.
Well, as my older brother used to say, that human beings were never meant to know all the things happening in the world at the same time. They get brain damage. It's really, this whole business of, my son likes to describe it as people are getting smarter as they get dumber, or they're getting dumber as they get smarter. So we're getting smart in a way and we're getting dumber in another way, but the part that we're getting dumb at has to do with survival. Well, that's not too smart. If you're going to be smart, you better focus on the survival, which is what everybody's now screaming about with climate change. Survival, survival. Well, climate change was being talked about 200 years ago, and nobody would consciously shut them up. And this has just been translated from the French, very interesting book by two French historians writing about how climate change is being talked about all this time. They knew it. It's just like Exxon. They knew what it was causing to the climate, but they just shut it up.
I was thinking it's also because in the idea of comparison, because now it's different to compare when you have this whole network of like.
You don't have to include big data. You don't have to include it all. It's a joke anyway. When you have too much data, you can't do any analysis. So you pick the issues, like violence against women. It's universal. It's not something they find among the Booga Booga or not the Booga or Islam or whatever. It's everywhere. The hardest working people and the most violent treated are women and their children, worldwide. Why don't we just start with that? That's pretty well recognized.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you.
I'll ask my question then. You mentioned that Cardozo's line that we should never forget that we can only see with our own eyes, and you said in passing we need to correct for that. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on, are there limitations to the corrections we can do? Or where do you see, is that something we can fix by correcting for it?
Well, you can only correct. I say to my students, the most radical thing you can do is talk to people who don't agree with you. Everybody wants to talk to people that agree with them, right? And that's part of the corrective. So people say to me, I don't know how you could be friends with her, like this woman that I went to the movie with. I'm going to be friends with her. I said, it's wonderful. I get different views. My neighbors were Republicans, and we talk, we walk in the morning. You know, I'm neither a Republican or a Democrat, so I'm even more odd, but, you know. So you just talk to people. You're in line at the grocery store, say something. Like when I was at Trader Joe's not too long ago, I said to the woman behind me, she wasn't looking, you know, at her whatever. And I said, did you know that Euclid was a carpenter? She said, he was? I said, yeah, the brain scientists are discovering that only if we use our brain and our hands that we really get good brains.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.